Be me Finn, 28, writing software for a living. Days run on a simple script. Push code, lift weights, unwind with a small, familiar circle. Nothing chaotic, nothing lonely, just steady. I'm not the type to work a room, but I'm fine where I am. Roughly a year back, I get introduced to Nora through a shared friend. She's 26, works at a nonprofit focused on helping people who actually need it. First meeting hits way harder than expected. Sharp mind, confident, speaks with purpose instead of buzzwords. We end up talking way past polite conversation territory. She carried this intensity that pulled you in without trying. Everything about her felt sincere, like she actually believed in improving things instead of just complaining about them. That honesty hooked me. It stood out against the usual background noise of apathy. We started dating, and the first couple of months were amazing. The kind of relationship you see in movies and assume is fake. We were super compatible, had great chemistry, and were always exploring new things together. She introduced me to new music, new food, new ways of thinking about things. Her perspective was heavily influenced by modern feminist theory. At first, I found it interesting. It wasn't something I'd spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'm always open to new ideas. She would point out tropes in movies or themes in songs, and I'd be like, I never saw it that way. It felt like an intellectual exercise, a cool quirk of her personality. I considered myself a decent, respectful guy. I believed in equality, treated everyone the same. So I figured we were on the same page, just using different vocabularies. The first signs that something was off were subtle. So subtle I barely even registered them as signs. It was more like a shift in the atmosphere, a change in temperature you can't quite explain. We'd be having a great day, laughing and joking around. Then I'd say something innocuous. Something I've said 1,000 times in my life without a second thought. For instance, we were in a hardware store getting stuff for the apartment. I held up 2 different drills and said, "I think this one has more horsepower. It feels more robust." Her smile vanished, just completely gone. The rest of the trip, she was quiet and distant. Later that evening, I asked her what was wrong. She explained that my language was problematic, that using words like horsepower and associating robustness with a tool was feeding into a narrative of toxic masculinity. She said it was a subconscious way men assert dominance over their environment. I was baffled. It was a drill, but I wanted to keep the peace. I wanted her to be happy. So I said, "Okay, I see your point. I'll be more mindful." And like a switch was flipped, she was warm and affectionate again. She kissed me and said she was proud of me for being willing to learn and grow. That night, she was incredibly passionate. I didn't connect the dots then. I just thought we'd navigated our first weird disagreement. This pattern started to repeat, becoming more frequent and more obvious. Let's call it the approval system. My level of correct thinking directly determined the level of affection I received. It was a complex, unwritten rule book that was constantly being updated without my knowledge. One evening, we were watching a classic action movie from my childhood. I made a comment about how cool the main hero was. Mistake. That triggered a 45-minute lecture on how the hero represented a savior complex, and his stoicism was a textbook example of emotional stunting glorified by the patriarchy. I tried to argue, just for the sake of discussion. I said, or maybe he's just a quiet guy who's good at his job. The temperature in the room dropped to freezing. She didn't speak to me for the rest of the movie. When we went to bed, she lay perfectly still on her side of the bed, a rigid wall of disapproval. I knew I wouldn't be getting so much as a hug. A few days later, we were talking about our jobs. I listened intently while she described a difficult situation with her boss. I validated her feelings, told her she was right to be frustrated, and used some of the terms she'd taught me. I mentioned that her boss's behavior sounded like mansplaining. Her eyes lit up. She told me how much it meant that I was finally starting to get it. That night, she couldn't keep her hands off me. I was the perfect, enlightened boyfriend. I had passed the test and was being rewarded for it. It became a constant draining calculus. Before I spoke, I had to run my words through a mental filter. Will this be interpreted as toxic? Does this support a harmful stereotype? Is this the correct opinion to have? It was exhausting. Our relationship stopped feeling like a partnership and started feeling like a probationary period for a job I wasn't sure I wanted. My friends started to notice a change in me. One of my oldest buddies, a guy I've known since we were kids, pulled me aside one day. We were working on his car, something we used to do all the time. He asked me why I'd been so quiet lately. I tried to brush it off, saying I was just tired from work. He didn't buy it. He said, "Dude, you're walking on eggshells. I've never seen you like this." I couldn't really explain it to him. How do you tell your friend that your girlfriend is withholding affection because you use the wrong adjective to describe a power tool? It sounded insane when I thought about it. So I just said we were going through some stuff. The control wasn't just about big social issues. It seeped into every corner of our life. Household chores were a minefield. I'd do the dishes, and she'd explain that the way I stacked them was inefficient and a product of men never being taught domestic labor optimization. I'd cook dinner, and she'd critique the meal as being too meat-centric, which she tied to male aggression and environmental disregard. There was no winning. My efforts weren't seen as contributions to our shared life. They were seen as opportunities for her to instruct me, to correct my ingrained masculine flaws. And every correction, every lecture, was followed by a period of coldness if I didn't accept it with sufficient gratitude and humility. The intimacy in our relationship was no longer a spontaneous expression of love and desire. It was a currency. It was a reward. It was a tool for behavior modification. If I was a good boy and parroted her opinions back to her, I was rewarded. If I was a bad boy and expressed an independent thought, the reward was withdrawn. There was a part of me that knew this was wrong, deeply wrong, but there was another part that kept trying to justify it. I'd tell myself that she was just passionate, that her intentions were good, even if her methods were flawed. I'd remind myself of the amazing person I met in the beginning and hope that she was still in there somewhere. I was in love with the memory of a person, not the one who was treating our bedroom like a courtroom where she was the judge and jury. The slow erosion of my own personality was the worst part. I found myself staying silent in conversations, both with her and with my friends. It was just easier not to have an opinion. An opinion could be wrong. Silence was safe. I stopped suggesting movies or restaurants because my choices were always dissected and found wanting. My world became smaller, tailored to avoid her disapproval. And I let it happen, because the alternative was constant conflict and the cold, lonely nights that followed. I felt like a frog in a pot of slowly boiling water. I didn't notice the danger until I was already cooked. One time, her parents came to visit for a weekend. I was on my absolute best behavior. I was agreeable. I used all the right terminology. I praised Nora's work constantly. I was the model progressive boyfriend. It was a flawless performance. Her parents loved me. And for that whole weekend, Nora was the woman I first fell for. She was warm, loving, and proud to be with me. The affection was constant. The moment her parents' car pulled out of the driveway, it was like the curtain fell. I made an offhand comment about being exhausted from playing the part. Wrong choice of words. She took it as me being fake to her parents, that my support for her was just an act. Her face hardened. So that's all it was? A performance? The warmth of the entire weekend evaporated in an instant. I tried to backtrack, to explain that I just meant it was tiring to be on for 48 hours straight for anyone's parents. But the damage was done. I had revealed that my compliance wasn't genuine, heartfelt change, but a strategy for survival. That night, the frost in the room was thicker than ever. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and feeling a profound sense of hopelessness. It didn't matter what I did. I would never get it right. The goalposts were always moving. The game was rigged, and I was the only one playing who didn't know the rules. But I still didn't leave. The thought of starting over, of dating again, was even more exhausting. And despite everything, there were still moments, fleeting glimpses of the old Nora that gave me a sliver of hope, a shared laugh over something stupid, a moment of genuine connection. Those moments were just enough to keep me hooked. They were the crumbs she dropped to keep me following the trail. Looking back, it's so clear. Her entire worldview was built around power dynamics. She saw patriarchy and systemic oppression everywhere. And instead of creating a relationship that was an escape from that, a partnership based on trust and equality, she replicated the dynamic in our own home. Only in her version, she was the one with the power. She wasn't trying to achieve equality. She was trying to achieve victory. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a convert, an ally who would follow her lead without question. And intimacy was her primary tool of enforcement, her leverage. It was the most effective weapon she had, and she used it with surgical precision. I was so focused on trying to understand her ideology that I failed to see the simple, ugly truth. I was being manipulated. It wasn't about feminism or social justice. It was about control, pure and simple. The realization didn't come in a sudden flash. It was a slow, creeping dawn, a collection of 100 small moments, 1,000 tiny cuts. Each cold shoulder, each transactional reward, each sigh of disappointment added another layer to the truth I was too scared to face. I felt weak and stupid for letting it get to that point. My self-esteem was at an all-time low. I started to believe what she was implicitly telling me, that I was flawed, that my instincts were wrong, that I needed her guidance to be a good person. It was a very lonely place to be. I felt completely isolated, trapped in a reality that only she and I understood. The breaking point wasn't a big, dramatic fight. It wasn't a shouting match or a thrown plate. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. No, maybe it was a Wednesday. The day of the week doesn't matter. What mattered was the event that preceded it. My job, which had been a stable and relatively low-stress part of my life, suddenly became a pressure cooker. There was a major project I had been leading for the better part of a year. It involved coordinating with multiple teams, including an external contractor we had hired. A few days before the final delivery, we discovered a catastrophic error in the code provided by the contractor. It wasn't a small bug. It was a fundamental flaw in the architecture that threatened the entire project. Months of work were about to go down the drain. And because I was the project lead, the responsibility fell squarely on my shoulders. My boss, a reasonable but demanding guy, was not happy. He made it very clear that if we couldn't find a solution, there would be serious consequences, not just for the company, but for my career there. The stress was immense. It was the kind of pressure that sits in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. For 2 straight days, I barely slept. My team and I were working around the clock, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, trying to salvage the situation. We were in full crisis mode. I was mentally and emotionally drained. All I wanted was to go home and find some comfort, some sanctuary from the storm. I wanted my partner. I needed my partner. That evening, I walked into our apartment, feeling like a ghost. I dropped my keys on the counter and just stood there for a moment, the weight of the world on my shoulders. Nora was in the living room, reading a book. She looked up and could immediately see that something was wrong. I didn't have the energy to filter my words or prepare a correct narrative. I just sat down on the couch, put my head in my hands, and told her everything. I told her about the contractor's mistake, the pressure from my boss, the looming deadline. I told her that I was scared of failing, of letting my team down, of the potential damage to my career. I wasn't looking for a solution. I wasn't looking for advice. I was just looking for a hug. For a simple human. That sounds awful. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I was looking for support. I laid my soul bare, vulnerable and exhausted. I looked up at her, waiting for that connection, that moment of empathy. She closed her book and placed it carefully on the coffee table. She had a thoughtful, almost clinical expression on her face. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she spoke. Her words weren't a comfort. They were an analysis. She started by explaining that my stress, while subjectively real to me, was a direct result of a hyper-competitive, male-dominated tech industry. She told me that my fear of failure was rooted in a patriarchal definition of a man's worth being tied to his professional success. She suggested that the entire situation was an opportunity for me to interrogate my privilege, to understand that my position, even in jeopardy, was one that many women would never have the chance to attain. Every word was like a small, sharp icicle piercing my skin. I just stared at her, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a debate. This was my life, my career, my immediate and overwhelming crisis. And she was treating it like a case study in her personal sociology class. I finally found my voice, and it was barely a whisper. I said, "Nora, I don't care about any of that right now. I'm not a concept. I'm your boyfriend, and I'm falling apart." I asked her, "Can you please just put the theories aside for one night and just be with me?" I was practically begging. I needed her to see me, Finn, the person she supposedly loved. I needed her to stop being a critic and start being a partner. She looked at me not with compassion, but with disappointment, as if I had failed yet another one of her tests, the most important one yet. Her voice was calm and steady, which made her words cut even deeper. She told me she couldn't, in good conscience, coddle my male fragility. She said that offering me unconditional comfort in that moment would be reinforcing the very systems she was fighting against. It would be a disservice to me and to her principles. She told me that true support wasn't blind sympathy, but helping me to achieve a higher level of consciousness about my situation. I felt the last bit of warmth in my body turn to ice. She stood up. She said she was going to sleep in the guest room to give me space to process my feelings in a constructive way. And then she walked out of the room, leaving me completely, utterly alone. I didn't move from the couch for a long time. I just sat there in the quiet apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. There was no anger, no sadness. The stress from work was gone, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. It was a moment of terrible clarity. The person I loved didn't actually exist. I had been in a relationship with an ideology, a set of rules, a political position. And when the real, messy, vulnerable human being in front of her needed her, the ideology won. It always would. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It vanished. My desire to please her, my fear of her disapproval, my hope for her affection, all of it, gone. It was like a switch had been flipped in my brain, and the power to that part of my heart was cut off for good. I wasn't her partner. I was her project. And I had just been officially declared a failure. I finally understood. You can't have a real connection with someone who sees you as a symbol. You can't find love with someone who values their principles more than your pain. I sat there in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a strange kind of peace. The game was over. I was no longer playing. I finally slept that night. It was the deepest, most dreamless sleep I'd had in months. The work crisis was still very real, but the emotional turmoil that had been my constant companion was gone. I woke up the next morning feeling a strange sense of lightness. The usual knot of anxiety in my stomach wasn't there. I got up, showered, and got dressed for work. Nora was in the kitchen, making coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. There were dark circles under her eyes. She tried to start a conversation, her voice tentative. She asked if I was feeling any better about the work situation. I just nodded and said, "It is what it is. We're working on it." There was no emotion in my voice. It was a statement of fact. I poured myself a coffee, grabbed a granola bar, and headed for the door. She said, "Finn, wait. We should talk about last night." I paused at the door and looked back at her. I said, "There's nothing to talk about. You were clear about your position." Then I left. The day at work was grueling, but my mind was sharper than it had been in ages. Without the constant background noise of trying to please Nora, I could focus completely on the problem at hand. The code started to make sense. I saw a pathway, a potential solution that was complex but might just work. My team and I hammered away at it all day. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope about the project. I got home late that night, mentally exhausted but in a state of calm focus. Nora had made dinner, a peace offering. It was my favorite dish. She had lit candles, put on soft music. The whole scene was a carefully constructed apology designed to pull me back into the fold. A year ago, I would have melted. I would have seen it as a sign that she really did care. Now, I just saw it as a tactic, a calculated move in a game I was no longer playing. I sat down and ate. I was polite. I said, "This is really good. Thank you." She took that as her opening. She started talking, her voice soft and full of contrition. She apologized for the night before. She said she had been too rigid, too caught up in her analytical framework. She admitted she should have just been there for me. It was a perfect apology. It hit all the right notes, but the words were hollow. They had no effect on me. It was like listening to a politician read a prepared statement. I just nodded along, finishing my food. "I appreciate you saying that." After dinner, she moved closer to me on the couch. She put her hand on my leg. It was her classic move to signal that the punishment phase was over and the reward phase was beginning. She was forgiving me for my ideological failure by granting me her physical affection. I looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. I didn't move away, but I didn't respond. I just stayed perfectly still. She leaned in to kiss me, and I turned my head slightly, so her lips landed on my cheek. I said, "I'm really tired. I think I'm just going to bed." I stood up, took my plate to the kitchen, and went to our bedroom. The confusion on her face was profound. It was a look I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock and disbelief. It was the expression of a programmer who enters a command, and the computer simply doesn't respond. A system error. I got into bed and picked up a book I'd been meaning to finish. A few minutes later, she came into the room. She tried to act normal, going through her nightly routine, but I could feel her watching me. She got into bed and tried again, moving close to me, trying to initiate something. I gently moved her arm away. "Nora, I'm not in the mood. I just want to sleep." My voice was quiet, but it was firm. There was no anger, no resentment, just a simple, unshakable fact. She recoiled as if she'd been burned. She lay on her side of the bed, facing away from me, and I could feel the waves of her confusion and frustration radiating across the mattress. But for me, there was only peace. The next few days were a masterclass in her escalating tactics. She seemed to have concluded that my rejection was a result of lingering anger. Her strategy, therefore, was to demonstrate what an amazing, supportive girlfriend she could be. She made my coffee every morning. She sent me encouraging texts throughout the day about my work project. "You're so smart and capable, you'll figure this out." She took care of all the household chores without any commentary or critique. It was a full-court press of affection and support. The problem was, it was about a week too late. I saw it for what it was, not a genuine change of heart, but an attempt to repair her primary tool of influence. She was trying to fix a broken remote control by putting new batteries in it, but the receiver on my end had been completely disconnected. My team and I managed to pull it off. We fixed the code. We deployed the project just before the final deadline. It worked perfectly. My boss was thrilled. He clapped me on the back and told me I'd saved the company's reputation. The relief was incredible. I came home that evening feeling 10 pounds lighter. Nora saw the look on my face and knew the crisis was over. She treated it as our shared victory. She opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. She toasted to me, to my talent, to my perseverance. She was positioning herself as the loving partner who had been my rock through the storm. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. She had been the opposite of my rock. She had been an extra weight, an anchor of judgment I'd had to drag along behind me. Later that night, she made her most direct attempt yet. She was confident. She had played the part of the perfect girlfriend. I had achieved my professional victory, and the logical next step in her script was the celebratory, passionate reunion. She approached me, full of confidence and desire, and once again, I gently but firmly shut it down. "I'm glad the project is done," I said, "but I'm just not feeling it." That's when her confusion finally curdled into frustration. The mask of the supportive partner fell away. Her voice took on a sharp, accusatory edge. "What is wrong with you?" she asked. "I've been nothing but supportive, and you're treating me like a stranger." I looked at her calmly. "Have you?" I asked. "Have you really?" I didn't need to say anything more. She knew exactly what I meant. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Her next tactic was to pivot to intellectual engagement. If she couldn't control me with affection, she would try to control me with ideology. She tried to draw me back into our old dynamic of teacher and student. She'd put on a documentary about social issues and pause it to ask for my opinion, clearly expecting me to give the correct answer I'd been trained to provide. I'd just shrug. It's interesting. No agreement, no disagreement, just neutral, low-energy responses. She'd bring up a news article about some celebrity saying something problematic. The old me would have joined in on the critique, eager to show I was on the right team. The new me just said, "People get upset about a lot of things." It was driving her crazy. I was robbing her of her power by refusing to engage with the framework she used to exert it. You can't win a debate with someone who refuses to argue. You can't lecture someone who refuses to listen. The apartment grew thick with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the tension of my impending failure anymore. It was the tension of her impending failure, the failure of her entire system. I met up with my friend, the one who'd said I was walking on eggshells. We grabbed a beer at our usual spot. The first thing he said was, "Dude, what happened? You seem different." "Different how?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "You seem taller or something. You're back." It was the highest compliment he could have given me. I didn't unload the whole saga on him. I just gave him the short version. "I just stopped caring about being the good boyfriend," I said. "I just decided to be myself, and if that's not good enough, then it's not good enough." He just nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "About damn time," he said. That conversation was more validating than 1,000 of Nora's conditional rewards had ever been. It was real. It was simple. It was the support of a friend who saw me as a person, not a project. Back at the apartment, Nora was preparing for her final gambit. If seduction, support, and intellectual dominance failed, the only tool left in her arsenal was direct accusation. She was going to go on the offensive. It happened on a weekend. I was sitting on the couch, reading, enjoying the simple quiet. She came and stood in front of me, blocking the light. She had her arms crossed. Her face was set like concrete. "We need to talk," she said. It wasn't a request. I put my book down. "Okay." And then it began. A torrent of accusations, all delivered in the detached clinical language of a therapist diagnosing a patient. She told me I was engaging in passive-aggressive behavior. She said my refusal of intimacy was a manipulation tactic known as stonewalling. She accused me of using the silent treatment to punish her, which she described as a form of emotional abuse. She said my emotional withdrawal was a clear symptom of toxic masculinity and an inability to handle being in a relationship with a strong, empowered woman. She was using her entire vocabulary of pop psychology and feminist theory against me. Every concept she had ever lectured me on was now a weapon aimed directly at my head. The old me would have been devastated. I would have been defensive, trying to argue, trying to justify myself. I would have been sucked into the vortex of her logic, trying to prove I wasn't the monster she was painting me to be. But I just sat there and listened. I let her say it all. I let the storm break over me. And I felt nothing. The words had no power over me anymore. They were just sounds. I realized she wasn't even talking to me. She was talking to a theoretical construct, a problematic man that she had created in her head. She wasn't angry with me, Finn. She was angry that her subject was no longer responding to the stimulus. When she finally ran out of steam, she stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for my reaction. She was expecting me to crumble, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to do anything that would put her back in control. I was quiet for a long moment. I looked up at her, my expression calm and neutral. And then I spoke, my voice even and steady, completely devoid of the anger she so desperately wanted to see. "Are you done?" I asked. The simple question threw her off balance. It wasn't in her script. "What? Are you done with the accusations?" I repeated. "I want to make sure you've said everything you need to say." She just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. I stood up, so we were at eye level. "You're wrong, Nora," I said, my voice still quiet. "This isn't manipulation. It's not abuse. It's not a tactic." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "It's a consequence." She just looked confused. A consequence of what? And that's when I laid it all out, not with anger or blame, but with the simple, cold clarity of an after-action report. "You spent the last year teaching me a lesson," I began. "You taught me that our relationship operates on a system of rewards and punishments. You taught me that affection, kindness, and intimacy are not freely given expressions of love. They are conditional. They are rewards for holding the correct opinions, for using the correct language, for behaving in the approved manner." I could see the first flicker of true understanding, of fear, in her eyes. "You taught me that my own feelings, my own struggles, are secondary to your ideological framework. You taught me that my pain is not something to be soothed, but something to be analyzed and critiqued." I took a step closer, my voice never rising. "A few weeks ago, when my career was on the line and I was at my absolute lowest point, I came to you. I wasn't asking for a lecture. I was asking for my partner. And in that moment, you gave me my final exam, and I failed." I saw a tear well up in her eye. But I continued. "You judged me. You found me wanting, and you administered the punishment. You withdrew. You left me completely alone. You taught me, in the clearest way possible, that in my moment of greatest need, I was not worthy of your comfort. I let that sink in. So, I finally learned the lesson, Nora. I learned it perfectly. I am no longer trying to earn the reward. I accept the result of the test. I am living with the consequences of my failure, exactly as you taught me to. I looked directly into her eyes. You're not being denied anything, I said. You're just not getting the transaction you want anymore, because the person you were making the deal with is no longer here. You broke the terms of the contract. This isn't me being passive-aggressive. This is me, finally, accepting the rules that you yourself created. The silence that followed was absolute. Her entire theoretical world, her entire system of control, had just been dismantled and handed back to her in pieces. The anger on her face collapsed. It was replaced by a wave of horrifying realization. Her tears started to fall, no longer a tactic, but a genuine expression of loss. She saw it. She finally saw it. She wasn't looking at an angry boyfriend she could win back. She was looking at a ghost. She saw that the man who had loved her, the man who had tried so hard to understand her and please her, was gone, and she was the one who had erased him. She whispered my name, her voice cracking. Finn. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to rewind time, to undo the damage. But it was too late. The switch had been flipped. The power was off. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a teacher, a judge, or a warden. I just saw a very sad, very confused woman who had built a prison for two, only to find herself the sole inmate. I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was distant, like watching a sad movie. There was no love left. She had traded it all for control, and in the end, she was left with neither. I turned and walked back to the bedroom to start packing a bag. The game was over, and I had won, simply by refusing to play.